So next up is item 6, which is the Tourism Public Improvement District. And Katie Zemsnik, and not sure if Tom Noonan is also speaking.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Oh gosh, I'm not quite that tall. So good morning. Yes, I'm Katie Zemsnik. I'm an assistant director with the Austin Convention Center, here to talk to you guys about the proposed Austin Tourism Public Improvement District. We're coming to council on August 31st to request approval of the draft service plan and petition language, which will be the first step in creating the TPID. And so we wanted to come to this committee, and we will also be briefing the full council on the 29th on what's in the TPID, what a TPID is, and how the funding that will be generated from the convention center's allocation will ultimately flow to the city as unrestricted revenue. So why create a TPID? So TPID is a special type of public improvement district. It's created at the request of the hotels within the city. And it's to self-generate funding so that they can give group business incentives and do sales and marketing activities, all with the goal of increasing hotel activity within the city. Austin's tourism district, or proposed tourism PID, will provide some additional benefits. As I mentioned on the slide previously, will generate funding that will be able to be transferred to the city as unrestricted revenue for city priorities through the success of the Austin Convention Center. Creating the TPID will allow us to remain competitive with our peer cities that already have TPIDs in place, such as San Antonio and Dallas. It will also provide a level of critical funding for tourism in Austin during the years that the convention center will be closed for the redevelopment and expansion project. And then last and certainly not least, it will contribute to increased hotel occupancy tax growth, which benefits our cultural arts, historic preservation, and live music efforts. So the Austin specific service plan, as I mentioned, it's composed solely of hotels, and it's only hotels that have 100 rooms or more that are within the city of Austin limits. This TPID has a 2% assessment on the gross taxable room nights of those eligible hotels. Council will approve the budget and updated service plan annually. It will be overseen by a TPID management corporation that will be created as an agreement between the city, the management corporation, and Visit Austin. And that will come as part of the creation documents when we come back before council. The budget allocation is contained within the service plan. It's a 10-year service plan, and everything that's contained within it will remain in that way through the 10 years. In order for the petition to be valid, you must be approved by over 60% of the hotel ownership groups within the city. And then the Austin TPID plan includes a primary and secondary program of work that I'll walk through in a later slide. And then I did want to acknowledge that this service plan that is before the City Council on the 31st is different than what was brought to City Council in November of 2020. At that time, the stakeholders requested a postponement for some more due diligence. We were in the middle of the COVID pandemic. And we've been working diligently to come to an agreement on this service plan in the time since. However, the world has completely changed for the hoteliers in that time. They were decimated. The hotel industry was decimated by COVID. And then additionally, in 2020, we were envisioning that the convention center would remain open during the expansion process. And we have now switched, and we will be completely closing the facility. So as I mentioned, the primary program of work, it spells out the budget allocations within the service plan, and this is in effect when the convention center is operational. So for this current 10-year PID, it would be first couple of years before we close in 25, and then again upon reopening in 2029. And breaks down the different categories and how they're going to allocate the revenue that's collected underneath, under that 2% assessment. So the first category is the convention center group business incentives. And so this is the one that we'll focus on some more slides. This is the category that ultimately will allow us to transfer funding to the city as unrestricted revenue. The service plan allocates 20% of total revenue from the TPID for this category. However, it does also allow for an additional 20% from the category below if the convention center is able to expend all of its incentives allocations in a given year. And I'll quickly pause just to explain sort of what our incentive program is. So the convention center, like every other convention center in the country, takes a look and evaluates every piece of business that we either compete for or wants to come and book at the Austin Convention Center. We take a look at the total revenue that these events will bring in, not just the revenue to the convention center. So that's things like hotel tax, sales tax, et cetera. And then if they hit a certain threshold, we will provide incentives. Often it's usually just discounts on facility rental, that kind of thing. That's our normal course of business, and without the TPID, that's just revenue that we otherwise would have received at the convention center. But in recognition of the extraordinary impact of these events, we're willing to forego that revenue. And then we also will see it will be made whole through our allocation of the hotel occupancy tax. With the TPID, we are now able to be reimbursed for those incentives that we are giving, and then we can transfer that over to the general fund as unrestricted revenue once the event takes place and the state statutes are satisfied. So for under the primary program of work, convention center is eligible for up to 40% of the total allocation of the TPID dollars. The next category is the sales and marketing activities. It's allocated at 60%, but that could go down to 40% if the convention center is able to give incentives up to that 40% amount. This is the bulk of the work that the TPID will be doing. This is the Visit Austin initiatives that they'll be undertaking additional sales trips, familiarization tours, event trust funds, all these kinds of activities that are designed to really generate tourism and hotel room nights within the city. And it's going to be a critically important component for tourism in the city when the convention center is closed. 10% of the total budget will go toward hotel business incentives. This functions very similarly to the convention center's allocation, except it's for events that occur solely in hotels. And then the last 10% is allocated for research and administration. We'll take a look at all the activities that the TPID is doing and measure if they're being effective in actually generating the hotel nights that it's designed to do. So focusing a little bit more on that first category, the Convention Center Incentive Program. So I mentioned again the primary program of work. I won't go back over that. The secondary program of work is in effect when the convention center is under construction. It was created to allow the convention center to still give incentives while the convention center is closed. We'll be, booking events at Palmer, looking at citywide approach, looking at other city facilities to see how we can accommodate those events that still want to try to make it work here, and any events that we'll be booking during the closure period. However, it does recognize that the level of incentives that the convention center will be able to give is going to be significantly less than when it's fully operational. So that means when the convention center is closed and the secondary program of work is in effect, the total convention center incentive allocation is reduced from 20% to 10%. That 10% that's remaining is converted to the variable room night generation category. And this just creates flexibility for those dollars, and it can be spent on any eligible use for the TPID, including additional buy downs at the convention center. So we'll be working diligently to ensure that we get that full 20% during the closure. It also creates a reopening fund. So if there are any dollars that we're unable to encumber or spend out of our allocation, it earmarks 50% of those into a reopening fund that will be available to the convention center and then eventually the city once the events occur when we reopen the facility. So how do we get from TPID to general fund? So we created this graphic that just kind of shows how we start at the top and move all the way over, and then eventually the city has that unrestricted revenue. So the first step is the hotels pay their 2% assessment, similarly to how they remit their hotel occupancy tax. They do this either quarterly or monthly, just depending on the hotel. So as part of the budget every year, and that's something that the City Council will see, the Convention Center will submit its estimated incentives and the events that it's asking for reimbursement of those incentives for every year. And then the Management Corporation, which is overseeing the day-to-day activities of the PID, takes a look at it, says this all looks good, this seems fine, it's in the budget, and then council will also approve it later. And then the event that has the approved incentives actually occurs. And I'll quickly stop here again just to walk through an important piece of this and just to set some expectations. So the convention center books business years in advance. So in 2026, we'll start booking the new building in 2029 and 2030. So that means that we'll be using our allocation of our dollars from the TPID for events that are occurring in the current year and for future years. Those future year events, the funding that we earmark for that must remain restricted and encumbered until such time as the event actually occurs. So that means the only dollars that can be transferred to the city are those that have, after the event has actually occurred. So it would be those current year dollars. So this means that the transfer that you see from the TPID to the city may not match up exactly with the allocation of the revenue that is contained within the service plan. And we'll be updating those revenue numbers and expenditures as part of the budget process every year as well. So the event happens. We submit all of our documentation to the TPID to say the event happened. Here's the final incentives we gave. We'd like to be reimbursed for that. Once that happens, the management corporation will then transfer that incentive over to we're creating a special revenue fund, and creatively, I think we're calling it the TPID fund, just for fun. And so it will be transferred there, and at that point, it is now unrestricted revenue. And so we will collect, as the year goes through and events happen, we will be collecting revenue into that fund, and then it will be transferred over to the general fund as part of the budget process. And council at that point is able to make their allocations based on council priorities. Oops, skip the important slide. So how much money are we talking about? So this is from the service plan, and this shows the estimated collections for a 2% assessment. The revenue projections have a 7.5% growth rate, and this is very optimistic, but it's designed that way so that we can ensure that we're capturing all of the revenue that may come in the year. It's possible that these numbers will actually be a little bit lower, and I would say probably likely. So the column with the pink header is the ACCD incentives, and so that's the allocation that would ultimately come to the city. You can see the 10 years, it's about $78 million. There's another caveat, of course, because can't possibly get through one of these slides without a caveat. If you look and see where the light tan headers are, so 2024 and 25 all the way down to 2028, 2029, those rows, you'll see the asterisks next to that funding. That is when the secondary program of work is in effect. And so that's when the convention center's allocation is reduced from 20% to that 10%, although we have the ability to get back up to that 20%. So this means that there's actually a range of funding that could come to the city based on this level of incentive. So $78 million if we get just straight 20% all the way through. It can go up to 120 if we're able to max out and get that 40% in the primary program of work. But it may also be all the way down to $60 million if we aren't able to get to that full 20% during the years that we're closed. And again, we'll be updating these numbers every year as we as we do our budgets, or as the TPID does their budget and comes to council for approval. I'll quickly talk about the governance slide. So as I've said, I think 5 times now, the TPID is going to be overseen by the TPID Management Corporation. It's, again, created under a contract between the city, Visit Austin, and the Management Corporation. They'll oversee the day-to-day operations. They are overseen by a board of directors that's composed of hotels. I think there's 11 members, and it's a representation of all different levels. So you've got big hotels, medium hotels, small hotels. There are also 3 ex officio members that will be a part of the board, Visit Austin's president and CEO, the Hotel Lodging Association's president and CEO, and then the Austin Convention Center. I'm on my last slide, I swear. So next steps in the activation process. So as I said, we will be coming to council on August 31st, requesting approval of the draft service plan and petition language so that Visit Austin and the hoteliers and the Hotel Lodging Association can collect the signatures from the hoteliers. Again, we have to hit that 60% threshold of the ownership groups to sign on. We estimate this process is going to take about 2 months. Once the service plan has been approved, it can't change at that point, or else we have to start the petition process all over again. And so that adds another level of delay. Once the threshold is exceeded, come back to the city for validation of the petition signatures. And then at that point, we can come back to council and actually create the district. There will be 2 public hearings on the creation of the district, one about the creation and the second on the assessment rate. And that can happen on the same day that council actually creates the district as well. So once council approves the district and we have it created and all the back end is taken care of, we can start beginning that assessment. And then the funding from the convention center's current year business will start to flow into that fund. And then again, as I mentioned, during the 2025 budget process is when we anticipate and would recommend that City Council take a look at what's in that fund and then allocate based on their priorities. And with that, we can take any questions.
Thank you. Councilmember Ryan Alter.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Katie, for that. I was wondering if you could tell us if you have projected or what the buy down amount was or is planned to be for fiscal year 23-24.
Yes. So
not through the TPID, but
yes, our actual incentive. We actually did an analysis from now until we close, and it's going to be about $3.5 million. We did about $3.5 million in FY22, but we are starting to see events having to book elsewhere in anticipation of the closure. That's those multi-year events that come to us every single year, and so we are seeing a slight drop off in that, and so we're anticipating about $3.5 million until closure.
And you said it's a slight drop off. How does that compare to prior years in the 4s or in the 5s? What significance has the drop off been with the anticipation of the closure?
Oh, in terms of the number of events, or
well, in just terms of that dollar amount, that $3.5 million. Was
Sure.
it closer to 5? Was it closer to 4?
So in 22, we did 3.5 for just that one fiscal year. So it's you're talking like maybe another 500,000 or so. So
Okay.
It's not huge in the grand scheme of things, although it is
Right.
significant in terms of trying to get the funding from the TPID.
So looking at the chart here where it talks about potentially 23-24 being $5.5 million in eligible buy down, that's just, given your number, there's not an extra $2 million worth of buy downs out there to be had.
Probably not. We are actually looking at our incentive program and looking at how we're calculating it in order to see how we can maximize what we're getting out of that. And so we're hopeful that we'll actually be able to increase that amount if we're, between now and probably January is when we anticipate that we'd be starting to collect for the TPID. And so we've got some time to really rework that program. It won't look any different for our clients, but on the back end, we'll be able to kind of maximize what that discount actually looks like.
And so when in the service plan, when it says that it's going to be a minimum of 20%, that's not a true minimum, right? I mean, if it's less than 20%, that's not just given to the convention center. It is reallocated through the process here. It says that at the end of the fiscal year, surplus funds will be allocated to subsequent fiscal years. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we've actually built language in there as well. So we'll be using, so we might take, 500,000 or whatever and use it for the next year's events. And so those funds are not eligible to be reallocated. And so we'll be working to maximize what funds we're encumbering for future events with each year's in order to maintain and ensure that that funding stays within our category. But yes, the management board of directors has the ability to reallocate surplus funds in the next fiscal year.
Okay. And then you talked a bit about the closed years, that 10% bifurcation. Mm-hmm. So for the first 10%, like you said, that's supposed to go to buy downs, not at the convention center, but Palmer or other. But once again, we can't, it's not a 10% guarantee, it's a hope, right?
That's exactly right.
Okay. And then if we don't hit that full 10%, half will go to the reopening fund and half potentially reallocated.
Correct.
For the reopening fund, is that exclusively for buy downs?
Yes.
So looking then when the convention center reopens, under the service plan right now, excluding the reopening fund, if we exceed 20%, mm-hmm. there's another 20% available, and it's a shall, so it will go there.
Yes.
Up to 40%, is there any real scenario where we exceed 40% and then have to dip into this reopening fund? I mean, that seems incredibly unlikely.
I would say that's unlikely, yes.
Okay. And then for the other half, the variable room generation, that is, it can go with in any of those other categories, including buy downs.
Including buy downs, yes.
But as we talked, pretty unlikely that we're going to exceed 10% in buy downs during the closure.
I would say that's not necessarily true because, as I said, in 26, we're going to start selling the new building. So we'll be eating up all of those dollars and encumbering them for when we reopen. So I think it is actually likely that we could get to over 10% in the years, certainly once we start selling the new building.
But to your point earlier, then that would be very delayed dollars. Those we wouldn't see those till 30
That's
and
correct.
beyond. Okay.
Although we will have a level of incentives during the current year, right? Because we will have events that happen during the years of closure at Palmer. It's just not going to be, $5.5 million.
Sure.
A little bit worse.
So I think you kind of alluded to it, and I think it's important to note, like, this chart is the absolute rosiest picture, best case scenario, but I think pretty unlikely. And so I'm a little frustrated in how we got here, in that there were agreements and as a prior discussion, but there were other agreements that would have potentially allowed for us to get guaranteed dollars, and the law was changed by those involved in this negotiation that prevents us from now doing that. And now we're stuck in a place where we're trying to get dollars here and there that's up to, if we're lucky, if it's the best case scenario. That's all I'll say with that. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues, any other questions? Thank you. I appreciate your questions, Councilmember Alter, and I share your frustration with how we got to this particular place versus where we started. Can you remind me how we pay right now for the security for South by Southwest?
I think it's part of the fee waivers in the city's budget process.
Okay.
But I don't know if we have any financial.
Did you consider making as part of what the ATPID pays for just directly a certain, like, we have a good sense of what that amount is, and if we waive those fees, unlike with the convention center, there is actually a cost that we have to pay for. So we have to pay for all the cops and any other first responders that we have to backfill in order to provide that security.
Yeah, so my understanding of the law now would not permit a direct payment for security services. It's restricted to sales and marketing and business recruitment specifically related to hotels. We can certainly have some conversations and take a look at what those fees are and how we might be able to get creative with some of our incentives for South by, and we can absolutely report back and get that to you.
Yeah, I mean, it would be helpful, when you talk about the $3.5 million incentives, what portion of those are South by? And do you count South by in those incentives, or can we more accurately reflect the incentives we provide under South by?
So the incentives that South by would receive is strictly confined within the convention center, and it's a discount off of their facility rental, and it's probably very similar and in line with what other conventions are receiving as well. It's based some on the hotel room, on hotel room nights, but we can certainly, take a look and see, like Katie said, if there's a creative option where we can look at what incentives the convention center is giving that could contribute in a roundabout way.
So when you talk about the $3.5 million, does that include South by?
It does, but it's a small percentage of the $3.5 million. It's not like it's $1 million of the $3.5 million.
Okay, just often when we see, the convention center data, South by has an outsized impact. So I was just trying to see if there was a way forward. Can you circulate to us the statute that is governing
Yes, we will.
the rules? Because I think that would be helpful. Okay. If there are no other questions, I guess we will continue this conversation next week at work session. I understand there's been a request to have a presentation there as well, and several colleagues who are not here, I know, have many questions about this. Mr. Noonan, I wanted to just recognize you before we conclude and see if you would like to say anything. You don't have to,
Well,
but you're welcome to if you'd like to.
Well, Madam Chair, I'm sorry I couldn't be there today. I'm home ill with COVID, as my entire family is, or I would have been there, and I will be better, and I will be there next week.
Thank you. I wish you a speedy recovery, and everyone be safe. Lots of folks are home with COVID. So thank you. Thank you, ladies.